I was fortunate enough to start this project at the Hoover Institution, Renewing Indigenous Economies. There are a lot of people who don't know anything about Indian country, and if they did, I think there'd be a greater chance that the institutions might be changed a little bit. And so at the Hoover Institution, in an effort to get people to better understand that, we have produced some videos, and I'm going to show you 3 of them. They're relatively short, and they say it much better than I, and you don't have to listen to me drone on. So I want to show you first a video about traditional indigenous economies. And if I can push the button and make this happen, it'll be a miracle. But
Native Americans have been asking people to recognize our rights since before 1879, when Chief Joseph said, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself." Early in the history of the United States, we lost sovereignty over our lives and jurisdiction over our land. The federal government forced us onto reservations, declared us wards of the state, and stripped us of our dignity. The federal government restricts individual and tribal rights to this day. This is the main reason why we are the poorest in the United States. But it was not always that way. Prior to European contact, Indigenous peoples had a long history of the dynamic economies and governance structures that we recognize today as the necessary ingredients for prosperity. Native Americans claimed their territories, made capital investments, and rewarded individual initiative. In the Southwest, agricultural peoples established clear ownership of floodplains, marking and enforcing land boundaries to reward stewardship. In the Southeast, families and clans owned cultivated gardens and orchards. Farther north, people marked trees to denote tribal boundaries, important pathways, and to claim forests for hunting, trapping, and timber. And along the Pacific, tribes used stones and marked trees to indicate ownership of spawning streams, fishing weirs, and clam gardens created by terracing beaches. Where societies considered land to be owned communally, individuals, families, and clans were generally entitled to the benefits of their work on that land. While Indigenous peoples were diverse, they all had well-established rules recognizing the ownership claims that allowed individuals, families, clans, and tribes to specialize in production and engage in trade. Long before colonization, robust trade networks connected tribes and the goods they produced. People from all over the continent gathered in places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico to trade everything from salmon to turquoise to buffalo hides, copper, and obsidian. In these hubs, trade languages such as Chinook in the Northwest and Mobilian in the Southeast emerged to make it easier to exchange goods and share knowledge. Plains tribes improved their nutrition with Pacific salmon, and coastal tribes stayed warm with buffalo robes from the interior. Trade fostered prosperity, allowing many tribes to devote significant time and resources to leisure, art, and religious ceremonies. To support all of this economic activity, tribal governments evolved to fit regional conditions consistent with their customs and culture. This enabled indigenous economies to adapt successfully to climate and technological changes. Indigenous traditions of treaty making and trade allowed Native Americans to adapt and prosper by trading with Europeans who brought beads, steel, horses, and other new commodities. Plains Indians, for example, became very successful horse societies. Native Americans didn't simply survive, they thrived. Eventually, however, as European settlement expanded, these dynamic, decentralized indigenous institutions were forcibly replaced by centralized federal authority. This had dire consequences for Native Americans. Tribes were driven from their traditional territories and onto reservations where tribal practices, like the Sundance and potlatch, were banned. What was once a relatively free, prosperous, and open society of indigenous economies was replaced with top-down, federal control that stripped us of our autonomy, dignity, and sources of wealth. In order for us to prosper again, we must regain the freedom and sovereignty to enjoy the same rights that other Americans take for granted.
Those videos, I'll put up the website at the very end, are available off of the Hoover Institution website, and we commend them to anybody that you think might prosper from watching them. Every time I watch those videos work with a group that watches them, I'm struck by the extent to which that video in particular captures what traditional indigenous economies were like, and that are part of why we call the project Renewing Indigenous Economies. But as Misty Kuehl, the narrator in the video notes, that was really replaced by colonialism. And that colonialism, I think, has continued to this day. And as someone mentioned earlier, Ernest Zicke loves to say it wrapped tribes in white tape. And I never use red tape anymore when I'm discussing these issues. I always say it's white tape. The notion that American Indians didn't have any culture that would interface with modern markets is crazy. Or as my good friend Crow member Bill Yellowtail puts it, being poor is not an indigenous cultural tradition. And as Misty puts it in the video, tribes didn't just survive, they thrived. And Russell Means, I think someone maybe pointed this out earlier about reservations, but Russell Means, in testimony to the U.S. Senate, said, if you want to see an example of failed socialism, and I might have said colonialism, go to an Indian reservation. And so, showing people the extent to which this white tape hinders the dignity, the sovereignty, and the prosperity of reservations, I think is a crucial part to clip the white tape that binds, that's the colonialism that binds and holds tribal economies down. And so there's a second video on, oops. No, I'd push that. A second video, which I may not be able to get to. Help. Which, again, walks people through the colonialism that includes the trusteeship that is such a hindering part of tribal institutions.
For hundreds of years, the federal government has assumed a major and active role in managing all aspects of Native American life, a much larger and more intrusive role than it plays in non-Native economic life. Even before our ancestors were forced onto reservations, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the federal government functions as our guardian. We were reduced to the status of dependent wards, but the federal government failed to protect us and actually helped extract resources from our lands for the benefit of non-natives. Reservation boundaries were often drawn and redrawn to exclude us from valuable resources like arable land, gold, and oil. The Dawes Act of 1887 was billed as a way of integrating Native Americans into American society and assimilating us as independent yeoman farmers. Indians were allotted 160-acre parcels, but did not get title to the land, which was held in trust by the federal government because, according to the government, we were not competent and capable. In practice, this allotment era further eroded our individual rights and tribal sovereignty, removing millions of acres from tribal jurisdiction. Things actually became worse in 1934 when Congress eliminated the pathways to securing legal land title and locked our land into federal trust in perpetuity. Many rules and regulations affecting tribal lands are still dictated from Washington, D.C., where the Bureau of Indian Affairs oversees the management of 56 million acres of Indian country. Tribal governments and members remain legally obligated to defer to federal agencies on everything from land use decisions to managing a loved one's inheritance. Most tribal governments rely on grants allocated by DC politicians and tied to meeting federal priorities rather than community ones. Over the centuries, a constantly changing regime of federal policies overturned economies based on entrepreneurship and replaced them with economies dominated by government interests. Starting a business is now very slow and difficult because without federal approval, tribes and individual natives cannot use trust land as collateral to obtain loans. A flourishing indigenous private sector has withered away. To revive Indigenous economies, we must reestablish tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction and restore the dynamic customs, culture, and dignity that existed before colonization.
I should know better than to use technology at my age. Once again, the message in that video is something that the average person in this country has no idea about unless that average person is a Native American who lives on a reservation. And as I said at the outset, I think making these points not just on the reservations where they're pretty obvious, but making these points in groups who make policy is crucial to making the kinds of changes that are necessary, I think, to take tribes back to the future, as I like to put it. And that brings me to the third bias, that American Indians can't take care of themselves. Remember, they're wards. That poverty requires more grants to solve the problem, and that the really only source of revenue for tribes is casinos like this one. When I'm speaking to non-Indian groups, I'm often asked that question, well, don't tribes just get rich off of reservations? Off of casinos. And I point out that there are a few casinos that do well, and I hope this is in that category. But by and large, remote reservations, and this one's remote if it weren't for Interstate 40, remote reservations like those in Montana are lucky to have any kind of casino business. Furthermore, and we've done some research on this topic through this project, states, once they saw the potential to be had from gaming, said, well, maybe we should get in the business too. And so in Montana, every corner gas station has a sign that says gaming, and that all competes with the tribal gaming profits. So that's not the path back to the future, although, again, tribes like the Coushatta, who have a very successful casino and have used the revenues from that to reinvest and reinvigorate the economy for the tribe as well as the state, those do have their role to play, but it's not the only way. And I want to talk just in a little bit then about what is the path back to the future, and what can we learn from the tribes that have shown some success. And before showing the third and final of these videos, I want to emphasize that these success stories aren't coming from economists like myself, who maybe grew up close to a reservation and know a little more than some of my colleagues at Stanford University. They're coming from tribal entrepreneurs, and not just entrepreneurs who invent things, but entrepreneurs who see ways of changing the rules under which tribes operate, changing the institutions, the rule of law that is so important. And you've heard some discussion throughout the day about the importance of tribes having secure rules of law, having tribal courts that understand how that rule of law can affect people's willingness to invest in reservations, and that kind of entrepreneurship may be just as important, or maybe perhaps even more important than entrepreneurship that develops this new widget or gadget that's going to create jobs. So let me close then with the last of the videos on what are the prospects for renewing Indigenous economies. What would I do without you?
As Native Americans work to rebuild our nations and renew our economies, it is time to finally liberate tribes and tribal members from federal oversight. While the federal government must abolish its discriminatory laws, Indigenous communities must also strengthen their own tribal laws. Across the country, Indigenous communities are reforming their governments and reviving private sector economies. Tribes with diverse languages and cultures are reasserting jurisdiction over their land and people, reestablishing tribal sovereignty. Beyond escaping oversight from the federal government, successful tribes are actively restoring the rule of law to spur increased economic activity. That means clarifying tribal jurisdiction, upholding and enforcing contracts, and creating an attractive investment climate, critical for encouraging economic activity. Tribes like the Pascayaqui are establishing independent judiciaries or relying on arbitration like the Navajo Nation peacemaking program to settle business disputes without political manipulation. In Nebraska, the Winnebago tribe built a casino to generate an influx of capital for their nation. This was the first step of a strategic plan for meaningful self-governance and economic prosperity. Instead of only distributing profits to tribal members, the Winnebago tribe established Ho-Chunk Incorporated, an independent economic development corporation that financed the infrastructure necessary to attract investors, businesses, and residents to the reservation and to create jobs. The Winnebago enacted and strengthened tribal laws and tax codes to free their economy from outdated federal laws and regulations. They reestablished trade with neighboring tribes. Within 1 decade, median household income increased over 60%, and reservation poverty was reduced to just 5%. By enacting tribal laws, explains legal scholar and Ho-Chunk CEO Lance Morgan, the tribe expands and flexes its sovereignty. It's really quite simple. Federal Indian law is restrictive, and tribal law is expansive. In Colorado, the Southern Ute tribe exercised their sovereignty to tap oil and gas resources without harming their natural environments. They used their oil and gas dollars to diversify their economies and provide monetary dividends, crucial infrastructure, social services, health insurance, and college education to tribal members. Across the country, diverse tribes are finding ways to benefit from modern market economies while protecting their unique customs and culture. But they have some things in common. Successful Indigenous economies have legal institutions that respect the rule of law and ensure the enforceability of contracts. Despite the persistence of colonial obstacles, many Native Americans are regaining control over their lives and their resources. This economic renaissance in Indigenous communities is about more than prosperity. It's about dignity. As Bill Yellowtail, member of the Upsalika Crow, explains,
Indian sovereignty means re-equipping Indian people with the dignity of self-sufficiency, the right not to depend upon the white man, the government, or even the tribe. This is not a new notion. It is only circling back to the ancient and most crucial of Indian values, and understanding that the power of the tribal community is founded upon the collective energy of strong, self-sufficient, self-initiating, entrepreneurial, independent, healthful, and therefore powerful individual persons. Human beings, Indians.
I don't think there's a more powerful statement than the last one by Bill when he says human beings, Indians. Oh, look at that, I've made it go forward. I want to talk about one more success story that isn't in the video. It's one again in Montana, on the Flathead Indian Reservation in northwestern Montana. We undertook a study to compare and contrast the tribal management of the forests on the reservation with the nearby Lolo National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service management, if you will. And we found several things that I think were just fascinating about it. First off, the tribe was able to get control of its forest so that it manages the forest the way it wants to. And it cares about all of the things that go with forests: clean water, wildlife, sustainability. But it also cares about profits. The tribe makes $2 for every dollar it spends. The federal government earns 50 cents for every dollar it spends. I always like to say, which would you like to own some shares of? So the tribe does well. They have a better species distribution of trees, a better age distribution of trees. They have better water quality, better wildlife habitat. Any measure we could think of to try to compare the management, the tribe was better at doing it than the federal government. And I think, again, the story there has to do more than anything with what happens when tribes have the sovereignty, the dignity, the ability to call the shots to free themselves from white tape, as Ernest puts it. So what will it take to move forward? What will it take to move back to the future? And I think that in some sense, the answer to the earlier question today, what can we do? It's going to require secure ownership rights for indigenous people. This means, as Raymond put it today, the tribes should own the land, not the federal government. Now, how much of that then devolves to individual tribal citizens, that's up to tribes to decide, not to the federal government. But it requires secure ownership rights because it's those ownership rights, the notion, I own this place, that leads to the stewardship and profitability of the lands. And it requires self-governance that exists certainly in the rhetoric of sovereign nations, but it doesn't necessarily carry over into the exercise of the tribe's jurisdiction over lands and people. When I think about what it means to be a sovereign government, and I think of the town of Bozeman, where Monica and I live, it's a sovereign local government, and it has some powers. It can tax. It can, as Raymond put it earlier, it can pass zoning laws. It can pass city ordinances. But that's very difficult in a tribe that doesn't have those kinds of powers. And again, I especially emphasize the taxation. If the tribe has no source of revenue other than the grants it gets from the federal government, then the tribe is going to have a hard time truly being a sovereign nation. And it's going to require, therefore, some fiscal independence that allows tribal governments to set their own priorities and to do what the community wants done, as opposed to what people in Washington, D.C. might think is the best thing to happen. As one tribal leader put it after I had been involved in a program much like this, he said, let me see if I get this. So we should have taxation and profits, not grants. And I said, you got it. Now, that's not an easy path. It's not an easy thing to do. We had a program in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago to which we invited several policymakers, people from Congress, and we discussed some of the potentials for success. And one of the people who came was Terry Brocky, who at that time was the CEO of a company on the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana, a company called Island Mountain Investment Corporation. And they are making big profits, and those profits go back to the tribe to provide scholarships for students, to help build infrastructure. It's the kind of thing without which it will be virtually impossible for tribes to ever cut the white tape that binds them. It's not a simple process, and it's not one that I or any other economist, political scientist, or academic in general can tell tribes what to do, but I think it's the kind of rebirth that's occurring across Indian country as tribes recognize what it means to be sovereign and how to exercise that sovereignty. This all comes back to the quote that's in the earlier video, and every time I read this quote, I have it on my business card. Every time I read it, I just try to imagine what it was like for Chief Joseph after his long struggle of trying to maintain some semblance of freedom, being dragged back to Washington, D.C., and giving the speech in which he said what's written on the screen here. Just let me be a free man. And I think that's what supposedly a free country is about. And yet, back to how I introduced my presentation, imagine a country where people are wards of the state, where people are not competent and capable until they're told that. Chief Joseph understood what it takes to break those bonds, and it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of message that I think, as I said at the outset, isn't just important for tribal members to know, but it's important for people who are non-tribal members, who are policymakers, who influence the decision makers as to what it is that is binding, is the colonial white tape that binds tribes, and what it will take to get rid of that. Once that happens, I think there's a great deal of hope, and I think Indian country today is showing much more of that hope. We at the Hoover Institution and the program on renewing indigenous economies we do research workshops that could put any of you to sleep in minutes, but they're research workshops that produce some of the output that Carolina had on the table out there, some of the briefings we've done, and they demonstrate such things as the connection between improving the cultural heritage, or the preservation of the cultural heritage of tribes based on more successful prosperity. It's the data behind those that I think is important to show just what the kinds of institutions that I've been talking about are all about. We meet with policymakers, we meet with tribal leaders, as we are in this case. We produce these kinds of videos, and I don't want to end without putting emphasis on a program we have for Indigenous students. We hold it in the summer at Stanford University. There's a flyer in the booklet. We hope that you will, if you know any students who would be interested, send them our way, because we think that it's the youth of Indian country that will really create the turning point that's necessary to renew indigenous economies. You can find lots more of that information at hoover.org/RIE. And you can always email me, and I'll be happy to respond in any way I can. For now, let me just again say thanks for including me. Thanks to Joe and ACES for keeping alive this notion that freedom and entrepreneurship are what will lead to prosperity, sovereignty, and dignity. With that, again, thank you, and let me take any questions if you have them. And if I'm now standing between you and the bar, feel free, we can. Sir.
So I think the egalitarian portion of the society of America needs to understand that when we're talking about poverty and impoverishment, we're talking about the earth and keeping the earth healthy, not so much about putting dollars in our pockets. And I think there's a basic difference between capitalism, colonialism, and who we are as indigenous people. The only part that I could get, that I could identify with is, yeah, if you got 5 fingers, chances are you're human. And that's what the United States can't figure out. So, you know, the egalitarian portion may be the liberals right now that are being attacked by the Trumpians. But chances are, I don't see anything changing until we get rid of all the taxation process on that one nation. Because we are the poorest people, and yet we have the highest taxes. The highest taxes is to the city, okay? And we're the poorest people, and you want to make a profit by taxing the poorest people in this country? Doesn't make any sense to me. And the government, Navajo tribal government, is a byproduct of this capitalist system that needs to be gotten rid of. You know, because if we're going to save this earth, you can't do it with the extraction industry digging up, you know, your ground where you're going to plant flowers. It doesn't work that way. And that's exactly where we're headed. Right now, as a tribal government, is the extracting industry is going to save us. No, it's not. Saving the earth is going to save us. Thank you.
Thank you. You may recall in the first video the scene where the scoops are digging up the dirt and saying that the tribes lost their gold and their land and so on, and that's such a crucial part of understanding how we got to where we are. But there's another part that I think is important, and if I can use the buzzword of the day, sustainability. It's really a fancy way of saying taking care of the Earth's resources. That sustainability requires some way of having enough prosperity to be able to survive, do more than survive, but to thrive. And as you were discussing that, I was recalling a wonderful trip that Monica and I had an opportunity to take to the Crow Reservation, which has some of the largest coal reserves in the country. And we went out to where this was a few years ago when they actually were mining coal, and looked at the land, not just that was being dug up, and that you look at, and it's all strip mines, it's shallow coal, they can dig it easily, it's really high quality coal. You look at that part and you say, this is tearing open Mother Earth. And then right next to it was what the Crow were doing to restore that land after they dug the coal. What they were doing to bring that land back to productivity with the kinds of jobs and revenue that was created from the coal that belongs to them, held in trust, I should note, but that belongs to them. And I think, or my example of the Flathead Reservation and their management of their timber. These are examples of, and there are many more around the country, of tribes that understand the point you're making about being good stewards, but also are able to take the revenues that they can create from some of these resources and reinvest them into a sustainable kind of economy. So that's the first point I'd make in response. You started out with a very important point that I don't think I emphasized enough, and this is a point that I give full credit to Adam and Joe for teaching me. When I first engaged in studying traditional indigenous economies and what it might look like to renew indigenous economies, I didn't know there was such a thing as tribal law. I knew there was federal Indian law, and I studied that, and I criticized it, but I didn't know there was this thing called tribal law. And then met Joseph and had the good fortune of meeting Raymond and looking at the book that he wrote, and it has led me to understand just how important tribal law is to this back to the future. I just spent last week with a couple of Maori from New Zealand, indigenous people of New Zealand, and I was told that the High Court in New Zealand is now incorporating tribal law into its decision, taking account of what tribal law says, how important it is to tribal culture, how important it is to a rule of law, not just for people who live on reservations, but for the rest of the population as well. And the lessons that can be learned from traditional tribal law, I think, are crucial, again, partly for reservation growth and development and preservation of cultures, but also important for those of us who never even knew there was such a thing, to understanding what might be the path forward. And I'm uplifted by what I see going on, especially hearing from my friend Tamati from New Zealand, as to how important it is to incorporate some of these tribal legal ideas into the ways in which decisions are made in New Zealand. I guess I would just add one more point, having mentioned New Zealand. This project all started as, and we still describe it as such, some people from New Zealand, Canada, and the U.S. were at a meeting, and we sat around afterwards and said, we need to create an alliance for renewing indigenous economies, because the problems that we're discussing here today that exist in the United States exist all around the countries that were colonized by the people who came and discovered these places. I hope you know I put that in quotation marks. And that alliance is a crucial part, I think, of transferring back and forth the knowledge that exists amongst indigenous people around the world. If you got a copy of the little book that I'm a co-author on, and you look at the cover and read the inscription inside, my good friend Manny Jules, who was a chief of the Tsashwap band of Kamloops Indians, is an artist, and he did the artwork for the cover, and it depicts a southern hemisphere canoe and a northern hemisphere canoe, and those two canoes coming together and understanding better what this earth is all about, and what the institutions are that can help bind indigenous people around the world together. So I thank you for your comments. Any more questions before I'm trampled on the stampede to the bar. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. My name is Al Henderson. I want to preface my question with a story I want to tell you, and it leads up to it. I'm a reservation-grown Diné person. I grew up in Boston, which is north of Gallup, pretty much most of my life. My first language is Navajo. So I go to college after I graduated from high school. And I went through the whole curriculum. The focus in my mind was, I gotta follow the law. I promised to graduate in 4 years. I took all the prerequisites. I declared my major. It comes time for the review for my graduation. So the academic advisor who passes on my qualification to receive a baccalaureate degree, and I had a one-to-one conference. Flipping over my academic record, she looked at me and said, Mr. Henderson, you've never taken one of the required courses. And I said, what is that? She said, I noticed that your record does not show you did not take a required foreign language course. And I told her I did. She looked at me in a puzzled fashion. It's not written here. I said, yes. How come you did not take a foreign course? And I said, no. I went through school speaking the English language. That's my foreign language. So the point here is that I always say, in a very forthright and truthful manner, that what Navajo education has done is we have too much Belagana way of teaching. The Navajo language is not emphasized enough. It's a paltry way of teaching it, maybe 1 or 2 times a class in the regular curriculum system. So we don't have standards, controls over it. So when we have that kind of an educational system where we abide by the Belagana way of thinking, the enunciation, the concepts, the interpretation, the translation, it mixes confusing messages with the English terms and the Navajo terms. I have a very big problem with that. Now, the theory of public service, or the theory of public choice, you and I know what that means. So we have a lot of politicians who want to be elected, and they say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, lots of promises. When they get into offices, and they uphold the law, swearing, and they receive that accolade and be blessed with it, what happens? Self-interest takes over, i.e. politics. How does this factor into indigenous economy renewal? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to steal your line, and I will attribute it to you and mention that you studied a foreign language all through school. That's a great point, and one that is ignored too often. First point I'd make regarding the language is in one of the papers that was out on the table, but I think they're all gobbled up. And if you want more, just let us know and we'll get you this information. But one of the papers focused on what's happened to the renewal of language, native language, and how crucial it is to have some prosperity so that you can renew that. Again, I mentioned going to the Coshada Reservation for the first of the Chaco Canyon programs I attended, and I was just struck by both the language that was being saved and rekindled, and the art, the basket weaving, and the other aspects of culture that are being preserved. So I think that's a really crucial part. And then finally, I don't know if you caught the subtle point that he studied economics as I have, so don't hold that against him or me. But economists I was once told that a philosopher is a person in search of truth and a cynic is a person who's found it. And I'm pretty cynical, especially when it comes to thinking about politicians making promises. And how is it that self-interest gets set aside so that maybe there'll be some public interest? And I think the crucial answer is that that happens when governments are constrained, where they're constrained by democratic processes in general, when governments have a rule of law that restrict just how much you can say, I'll promise to do this and then not do it, or how much you'll promise to do it and you'll take from somebody to deliver the good to someone else. It's that kind of legal framework that's crucial to limiting the kind of self-interest that politicians from the very top down are faced with. And I think too often we forget just how important that legal structure is. I was struck by, mentioned Terry Brocky from the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana and the Island Mountain Development Group. And we were at the Montana governor held a tribal summit, the first that I know of in Montana, brought together tribal leaders from all of the reservations in Montana and had speakers like many of them here today. And after Terry spoke, I said, Terry, how is it that you can run a corporation and not have tribal politics take over? And he's a much bigger man than I am and has much longer arms. And he said, I keep them at arm's length. And I think that's another crucial part of understanding how it is we constrain the people who are in government to do what we want them to do, make sure they're kept at arm's length from our daily lives, but also producing the kinds of public goods that we want, the roads, the education, and so on. That's not an easy thing to do, and it's a key to groups like the Coushatta. I think it's a key to the tribes that have been successful. But whoever asked the question, how do we do it? I don't have a recipe for it. It's not one that comes easily. And it doesn't come easily in part because it's all part of culture. And the sort of rules that would govern the Navajo tribe, the Navajo Nation, are very different than the ones that would govern the Crow Nation in Montana. And those rules have to incorporate the culture that's a long tradition of how this works. Not an easy thing, but I think it's happening. And again, to me, it's the bright light in Indian country. Perhaps one more before we... Well, again, I thank you very much for your time, and I especially thank Joseph for putting this together. It's this kind of entrepreneurship on Joseph's part that will, again, make that light shine much brighter in Indian country. Thank you.